The night the Black Widow of Canaan came into the world, the Carolina air was heavy, thick with heat, superstition, and the faint sound of singing drifting from the slave quarters. The year was 1843, and in the vast plantation fields near the small settlement of Canaan, a child was born beneath a blood moon. Her name would be Mariah, but long before she spoke her first word, the people whispered that she was marked by death. Canaan was a place where the soil was rich and dark, and so were the secrets buried in it. The land stretched in every direction with tall pines and tobacco that grew high in the summer sun. The slaves who worked the fields often said the earth there remembered everything. Every scream, every grief, every ghost of a life taken too soon. To them, the land itself was awake. Mariah's mother, Elsie, was a quiet woman who moved like she'd already lived 100 years. She worked in the big house, serving the mistress of the plantation, Miss Caroline Whitefield, a woman of silk gloves, pearls, and empty eyes. That night, as the wind moaned through the cypress trees, Elsie gave birth alone in the dim corner of the quarters. There was no cry at first, only silence. Then a thin wail cut through the dark, sharp and trembling. The other women turned away. One of them whispered, "A child born silent before the cry always carries death with her." By sunrise, word had spread to the big house. Miss Caroline demanded to see the new baby. She studied Mariah, skin dark as the night she was born, eyes wide and unblinking, and said with a chilling calm, "Something about this one feels cursed." Elsie bowed her head and made no reply. In her heart, she knew it might be true, not because Mariah was cursed, but because every child born in bondage already carried a piece of death with them. As the years passed, Mariah grew into a girl with a quiet rage that simmered beneath her skin. She wasn't like the others. She didn't laugh easily, she didn't play. Her eyes were always watching, searching for something beyond the horizon, something that felt like freedom but tasted of sorrow. The other children feared her. Some claimed that when she stared too long at a dying animal, its final breath seemed almost calm, like she'd reached inside it and eased the suffering. The elders called her the widow, long before she ever married or lost anyone. The Whitefields' plantation ran on silence and fear. Mr. Whitefield ruled with the cruelty of a man who believed pain was a tool for order. Whips cracked at dawn, prayers went unanswered by noon, and dreams died before sundown. Every soul there lived at the mercy of his temper. Still, Mariah refused to bend the way others did. Her defiance was quiet but constant. A look, a pause, a refusal to flinch when punished. Something about her unnerved even the overseers. One evening, when Mariah was barely 15, she witnessed something that scorched her soul forever. A young man named Samuel, who'd spoken once about running north, was caught near the edge of the woods. Whitefield ordered that he be made an example. The slaves were gathered, forced to watch. The air was thick, the cicadas silent, the smell of fear sharp enough to sting. Samuel's eyes found Mariah's in the crowd. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He just stared, steady and proud, as if in that moment he passed his fire to her. When it was over, Mariah didn't cry, but something inside her broke quietly apart, the way glass does before anyone hears the crack. That night she didn't sleep. She sat beneath the trees and whispered to the dark sky, asking why death always came for the ones who wanted to live. And perhaps, she thought, if life refused to show mercy, maybe death would. From that night, people said strange things began to happen on the plantation. Livestock found dead without wounds. Men who'd raised their hands against others fell ill. The overseer's wife claimed she heard humming in the fields when no one was there. It was always the same melody, a tune Mariah had been known to hum to herself while washing clothes by the river. By the time Mariah turned 17, whispers followed her everywhere. Some called her cursed. Others said she was protected by something worse. The slaves avoided crossing her path after sundown. Even Miss Caroline, proud and cruel as she was, stopped ordering Mariah into the house after dusk. Mr. Whitefield said she was trouble, but useful trouble. He liked the way she worked without speaking, the way she moved through shadows like air. But trouble has a way of growing, and in 1843 there was no greater sin for a slave than to think like a free woman. One late summer night, a storm tore through Canaan. Trees bent and broke, fields flooded, and thunder rolled like war drums in the sky. In the chaos, Mariah saw her chance. She ran not north, not toward freedom, but somewhere else entirely. The others thought she had gone mad, sprinting into the storm with nothing but the clothes on her back. By dawn, the rain had passed, but Mariah was gone. No footprints. No trail, only a torn ribbon snagged on the fence, the same ribbon she'd been wearing the night Samuel died. Miss Caroline told the others not to speak her name again. Mr. Whitefield sent men to search the woods, but none returned the same. Some refused to go back at all, saying they'd seen something in the swamp, a shadow moving through the fog, humming that same mournful tune. Weeks turned to months. Harvest came and went. Then one morning, a field hand found Mr. Whitefield's prized stallion dead, eyes wide with terror, heart stopped though there was no wound, no mark. On the barn wall carved deep into the wood were two words no one could explain: Mariah waits. From that day on, no one in Canaan dared to wander after dark. The sounds in the night changed. The cicadas silent, replaced by something else, something soft and hollow, like a woman whispering a prayer too late to be heard. They said she'd traded her chains for vengeance, her freedom for eternal darkness. And though no one saw her again, they all felt her. The Black Widow of Canaan had been born, and death, it seemed, was still her first love. For months after Mariah vanished, the people of Canaan lived as though the air itself could punish them. The Whitefield plantation seemed quieter, lonelier, haunted by a presence that did not belong to the living. Those who remembered her face swore that they could feel her still, in the sudden cold of a windless night, or in the distant sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving through an empty field. The name Mariah became something you whispered only when the sun was up, and even then, only if no one else could hear. The overseer, Mr. Calloway, claimed to have seen her. It happened late one evening, as he rode home from inspecting the tobacco rows. His horse froze without warning, snorting and quivering, refusing to move. Calloway swore that he saw a figure standing just beyond the fence line, tall, still wrapped in shadow. He shouted a curse and raised his lantern, but the light faltered before reaching her face. All he saw was the glint of eyes catching the lantern's weak flame. He rode harder than he had in his life, making it back to the main road without daring to look behind him. The next morning his hands trembled so badly he could hardly hold his coffee. When word reached the quarters, no one expressed surprise. The old women nodded among themselves, whispering that Mariah's spirit was collecting debts. Each one remembered a moment of silence, a mark of punishment left on the world by men who'd thought themselves untouchable. But spirits, legends, they were the only kind of power these people were allowed to imagine. Miss Caroline Whitefield reacted differently. Her husband's cruelty had long become routine, but the thought that a slave, a mere girl, could defy death itself made her restless. She began to lose sleep, pacing her parlor in the dark, candlelight drawing hollow circles on the walls. Her mirror often caught her reflection unawares, and for an instant she swore she saw another face behind her shoulder. The servants who tended her room noticed strange things: wilted flowers on her dressing table, candles that went out on their own, and the echo of quiet humming coming from the window after midnight. Mr. Whitefield, on the other hand, dismissed all of it as foolishness. Ghosts are the refuge of guilty minds, he told his guests one evening over bourbon. There's no curse here, only lazy hands and trembling women. Yet the men of the plantation noticed that he had begun to carry a pistol tucked into his belt, even inside the house. His laughter came louder, quicker, as if to fill the silence that frightened him. Winter came early that year. The frost crept in through the fields before Halloween, coating everything in a white glare by morning. The harvest was poor, and the overseers blamed bad luck. But to the workers it was clear. Mariah's shadow was still walking the fields. Livestock refused to go near the orchard at night. And once, a young boy swore he'd seen a woman's footprints appear in the frost, each new step forming before his eyes, leading toward the old swamp. The swamp was the boundary, the edge of the known world for those who lived on that land. Children were told to stay away, that spirits lived there, feeding on the lost. It was said that even before Mariah's disappearance, strange fires sometimes flickered there without a sound or cause. The air carried a stagnant sweetness, the smell of rot and remembrance. But now the stories said that Mariah had made it her home. One frigid morning a hunter found proof. Near the swamp's edge he stumbled on a small shanty he hadn't seen before, half hidden under vines and moss. Inside lay remnants of a woman's life, a rusted comb, a faded blue ribbon, and a single pair of shoes too small for any of the workers he knew. No body, no grave, just silence thick as fog. When he brought what he found back to the main house, Miss Caroline fainted at the sight of the ribbon. It was the very same she had given to Elsie's daughter years ago, the girl she once claimed looked too proud for her station. That night, the house filled with the sound of breaking glass. A candle caught the curtains in Miss Caroline's room, and for a moment, the firelight danced like a living thing before it was smothered out. When the servants arrived, they found her standing in the center of the floor, eyes wide, hands clutching the blue ribbon near her chest. She said she had seen Mariah reflected in the mirror, her face unscarred, but her smile twisted into something between grief and promise. "She isn't gone," Caroline whispered. "She's waiting for him." The next day, Mr. Whitefield locked himself in his study and would not come out. He sent Calloway to fetch a preacher from town, but when the preacher arrived the following afternoon, Whitefield refused his entrance. "You can't bless what's already damned," he barked. That night, the preacher left without saying a word. It was the last time any outsider visited the plantation willingly. Weeks passed without incident, but the quiet was heavier than before. The enslaved workers avoided the big house after dark. Stories spread of Miss Caroline praying on the porch at dawn, of unseen hands tugging at her dress when she bent to light the lamp. Then one morning she was found gone. The bed empty, the door ajar, only frost on the floor and that blue ribbon lying neatly on the pillow. No one saw her again. The official story told in town was that Caroline Whitefield had run to her sister's estate in South Carolina, overwhelmed with grief and fear. But those who lived on the land said otherwise. They said she had gone into the swamp, called by the voice of the woman she'd wronged, swallowed by the mist before the first light reached the water. After her disappearance, Mr. Whitefield fell apart piece by piece. He stopped riding the fields, drank more, and spoke to no one but the walls. The plantation began to rot under his neglect. The workers still labored, but they did so with silent stares, feeling at last that the man above them was only flesh and fear. One evening, around the anniversary of Mariah's escape, a thunderstorm rolled through Canaan again, almost identical to the one from that night 2 years before. The wind howled through the trees, lightning splitting the sky open wide. Servants hiding in the quarters swore they heard laughter, soft, low, and feminine, carried on the rain. When morning came, the door to Whitefield's study stood open. His pistol lay on the floor, his chair overturned, and his body slumped against the window. The coroner called it suicide. But those who saw him first said his expression wasn't one of pain, it was of recognition, like a man greeting someone he had always known was waiting for him. From then on, the land changed. The fields grew wild, unworked. The big house sank into disrepair, its windows dark and hollow. Years later, travelers who passed by would sometimes see a figure near the swamp, a woman cloaked in black, walking with quiet grace, her face hidden by a veil, her eyes reflecting the pale light of dusk. People called her the Black Widow of Canaan. To some, a ghost. To others, justice given form. But to those who remembered, she was neither. She was Mariah, the girl who had chosen death not because she loved it more than life, but because it was the only thing that could never be taken from her again. For years after the fall of the Whitefield plantation, Canaan faded from the maps. The house was left to rot, its shutters bowed and walls crawling with ivy. Travelers on the old road kept their heads down when passing by, whispering that the land didn't want anyone else living on it. They said that if you listened closely near the swamp at dusk, you could still hear a woman humming, a melody born from sorrow, carried through the air like a warning. By the 1860s, most people around Canaan had forgotten the exact truth of what happened there. The Civil War came, breaking the old world apart. But even through all that chaos, the story of Mariah lingered like smoke. Freedmen who'd once worked those fields refused to build near them. They said her spirit was restless, still walking between life and death, protecting no one yet harming only those who dared disturb her silence. In 1871, a man named Elijah Porter, a freedman from Edgecombe County, bought a section of the old Whitefield land. He was proud, ambitious, wanted to turn the soil again, make it fruitful. He had a small family, his wife Ruth and 2 sons barely grown. The locals warned him not to go near the swamp, to avoid the ruins of the big house. But Elijah didn't believe in curses. "The Lord delivered me from chains," he told the storekeeper in town. "I reckon he can deliver me from shadows, too." At first, everything went well. The ground near the old slave quarters was still rich and easy to till. The family built a modest cabin near the edge of the field, a few hundred yards from the remains of the plantation house. By winter, they'd cleared enough land to sow corn and beans. Ruth sometimes gathered water from the stream that bordered the swamp, humming hymns to herself as she worked. But she never lingered there long. Once she told Elijah that she'd seen a shape in the mist, something slender and still, watching her from across the water. He told her it was her imagination. Yet after that, she refused to fetch water alone. The first real trouble came one hot summer evening. Elijah's eldest son, Isaac, was walking home from a neighbor's when he cut across the old orchard. The moon was bright, but the air felt strange, heavy and still. Near one of the dead apple trees he heard humming, a soft, haunting tune that seemed to echo from nowhere. Thinking someone was hurt, he followed the sound deeper among the trees. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute that he swore he could hear his own heartbeat echo back at him. He turned to leave and saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the orchard, dressed entirely in black. Her veil hid her face, but her hands were pale against the dark cloth. She didn't move, didn't speak. He took one step toward her, meaning to call out, when the air pulsed with a sudden wave of cold. The next thing he remembered was running. He couldn't say how or why, but some part of him knew she wasn't alive. When he finally stumbled through the door of their cabin, his skin was drenched in sweat, though his body shivered like it was frozen. Ruth tried to calm him, but he couldn't find the words. By morning, he refused to talk about it at all. The following week, strange things began to happen around the cabin. Chickens went missing. Their dog barked through the night at nothing. Sometimes in the corner of the field, footprints appeared after rain. Small, barefoot prints leading toward the swamp and stopping abruptly in the mud. Ruth started leaving a lamp burning by the window each night, hoping the light would keep the spirit away. But Elijah laughed it off. "Fear gives ghosts breath," he said. "Stop feeding them." Then came the voice. One night, Ruth woke to the sound of whispering outside their window. It was low and slow, the words indistinct but human. She shook Elijah awake, but by the time he opened his eyes, it had stopped. He grumbled and went back to sleep. But Ruth didn't. She lay listening, heart hammering, staring toward the window. The faintest melody, like the sound of a woman singing to herself, drifted in from the darkness. The same melody Isaac had described in the orchard, the same one Mariah had been known to hum by the river a lifetime ago. The next morning, Ruth found their youngest son, Daniel, sitting near the swamp. His feet dangled over the muddy bank, and his face was pale, trance-like. When she called his name, he didn't turn. Only when she touched his shoulder did he blink and look at her, confused. "Mama," he said in a quiet voice. "The lady says she's lonely." Ruth yanked him away, trembling. That afternoon, she packed their things, begging Elijah to leave the land. But pride, stubborn and heavy, anchored him. He refused to abandon what little they'd earned. "We fought too long to be free," he said. "I won't be driven out by a story." That night the storm returned to Canaan. Rain came down in sheets, wind tearing through the trees like teeth. The cabin rattled with every gust. Lightning flashed, revealing the outlines of the orchard from their window. Each broken tree a black silhouette in the storm. Between strikes of light, Ruth swore she saw movement, a woman's figure drifting through the rain, pausing before the cabin door. The next thunderclap shook the floorboards, and in that moment something cold passed through the room, snuffing out the lantern flame. Elijah grabbed his rifle. He swung open the door, yelling into the tempest, threatening whatever was out there. But all that answered him was silence. Then lightning flared again, and for a blink of time he saw her standing at the gate, the woman in black. Her veil fluttered though the wind had died. Her hands hung loosely by her sides, and in one of them she held the blue ribbon sodden with rain. Elijah froze, heart thundering. She lifted her head slightly, enough for him to glimpse her mouth, neither smiling nor frowning, just still, eternal. Then came her voice, faint but clear through the rain. "This was never your land. Only your chains changed hands." Ruth screamed his name. But when she reached the door, Elijah was gone. The rifle lay in the mud. The storm quieted by dawn, and the air settled heavy and still again. They searched for Elijah for days, but there was no trace. Just a line of footprints leading toward the swamp. Hands stopping at the water's edge. Ruth packed what was left of their life and never looked back. Isaac and Daniel followed her north, leaving the land behind to the wild. For years afterward, settlers who tried to reclaim that soil failed. Crops rotted, tools rusted overnight, livestock disappeared. People said Canaan wasn't meant for the living anymore, and beneath the shadow of the swamp the humming never stopped. By the turn of the century, the story of the Black Widow of Canaan had become legend. Most dismissed it as old superstition, the kind of tale told by farmers around campfires to scare children into staying indoors. Yet there were always those who believed, those who swore that the wind still whispered her name when the sun dipped behind the pines. The land remained largely abandoned, reclaimed by weeds and woods, and the swamp continued to swell and shrink with the seasons like a living heart. Then came a man named Thomas Harker, a northern investor who saw opportunity where others saw ruin. He arrived in North Carolina in 1901, a polished man in a dark overcoat with a pocket watch that ticked louder than his conscience. Harker had made his fortune buying foreclosed plantations and turning them into lumber estates. When he heard about the Whitefield property, he was told it was cursed, but he laughed. "Curses don't pay taxes," he said, smiling beneath his mustache. He purchased the land for a fraction of its worth. In town, the old men muttered that even gold could rot if it came from Canaan. Among them was Reverend Samuel Green, an elderly preacher who'd grown up on stories of the widow. He tried to warn him. "Some land remembers," he said, voice brittle with age, "and the widow remembers more than most." Harker only tipped his hat and walked away, thinking how easily fear could be silenced by progress. He arrived on the property one grey morning in March with a small crew of labourers. The once grand Whitefield house was nothing but bones, the frame blackened, roof sunken. Vines crawled up its walls like hands trying to pull it under. The air was damp, sweet with decay. Harker walked through the ruins, boots stirring the ashes of a century. He imagined building a mill here, clearing the overgrown fields, raising houses for workers. To him, ghosts were just the stories of people too poor to leave. But the men he hired were uneasy from the start. The nights in Canaan were unlike anywhere else, silent as if sound itself avoided the place. When they built fires to keep warm, the flames hissed and bent toward the swamp even when there was no wind. Tools went missing. Horses refused to approach certain parts of the property. One morning, Harker found the name Mariah carved into one of the old oak beams they had cut for lumber. None of the workers admitted to doing it. They said they'd never even touched the wood from that section, the part nearest the edge of the swamp. Still, Harker pressed on. By June, the mill was nearly finished. He brought his wife, Clara, down from Raleigh, insisting she see the land herself. She was a quiet woman, pale and watchful, with the kind of sensitivity that catches what others ignore. The moment she stepped off the wagon, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. "It feels wrong here," she whispered. "Like something's listening." Harker kissed her hand, called her fanciful, and went back to his plans. That night they stayed in a small cabin that had once belonged to the Whitefield overseer. Clara couldn't sleep. The frogs had gone silent, and even the crickets seemed to have vanished. Around midnight she heard humming outside, low, rhythmic, almost tender. She thought it was one of the workers, until she realized it was coming from the swamp. Curiosity mixed with dread, she looked through the window. The moon was bright enough to paint the marsh silver, and there, at the edge of the water, stood a woman cloaked in black, motionless and alone. Clara blinked, and the figure was gone. She woke Harker, trembling. But when he looked, there was nothing but thick fog rising from the ground. "You're letting their stories get to you," he said. "It's a trick of the light." But that same night the horses broke loose from the stable, tearing into the woods in panic. One was found the next morning near the swamp, its eyes wide, its body unmarked, its heart still warm. Harker didn't tell Clara about it. He pretended the rumors were wind and coincidence, though he'd begun to avoid looking toward the water himself. Weeks went by. The mill began production, cutting through the remains of old trees that had grown since the plantation's ruin. But the men worked slower now, glancing toward the swamp with the dread of hunted things. One evening, a sawyer named Jeb caught sight of something strange. A black veil tangled high in a pine branch. He climbed up, thinking it was cloth or tar paper, blown by the wind. But when he pulled it free, A blue ribbon fell from inside it, fluttering to the ground. By the next morning, Jeb was gone. His boots stood neatly at the riverbank, footprints leading toward the swamp and stopping where the water began. Harker declared it nonsense that Jeb had run off, fearful or drunk. But the rest of the men refused to stay. By the end of August, the mill stood empty except for Thomas and Clara. He tried to hire new hands, but word had spread through 3 counties. No one would touch Canaan. Frustrated and desperate, he worked the saw himself, sweating through his shirts, cursing the town's foolishness. One afternoon, he chopped through a beam of old wood pulled from the ruins of the Whitefield house. To his shock, the blade struck something buried deep inside, a long, narrow bone blackened with age. The thought of it pulled a strange chill through him. He buried it quietly in the soil behind the cabin without telling a soul. That night he dreamed of a woman standing over him. She wore black, her veil damp and clinging, and her voice was a whisper of grief. "You can't bury memory," she said. "It grows roots." He woke gasping, heart pounding. Clara sat beside him watching. "She's come for you," she said softly. He started to protest, but her eyes were fixed on the window. There, in the thin light of dawn, stood the figure from Clara's vision, the black-clad woman, veiled and still. Harker leapt up, ran outside into the morning mist. The space was empty within seconds. Yet beneath him the earth felt hollow, shifting. A trapdoor of soft ground. As he stepped back toward the cabin, a voice brushed his ear like breath. "You built your house on the bones of the dead." Harker froze. No one was there. But when he glanced back toward the river, he saw something rippling under the fog, something moving slowly, deliberately, as if circling the land itself. By evening he was packing to leave. Clara didn't argue. Neither spoke of what they'd seen. As they rode away, she looked once more toward the swamp. The trees swayed, though there was no breeze. And from deep within came that same melodic hum, the song of a woman who had once lost everything but her vengeance. The mill rotted within a year, reclaimed by mud and moss. Locals said Canaan rejected their trespass as it always had. The Black Widow had reclaimed her home, and once again the land slept, waiting, patient as ever, for the next soul foolish enough to wake her. Decades passed, and the story of the Black Widow became a ghost worn thin by retellings. Canaan was nothing more than a sigh between small towns, a forgotten patch of Carolina earth that no mapmaker bothered to label. By the 1930s, the land had returned to wildness, thick vines, rattlesnakes, the smell of wet pine and iron. Only the most desperate souls came near it, and most didn't stay long enough to make a home. In 1936, in the heart of the Great Depression, a man named Robert Red Parker arrived with his wife and infant daughter. They had nowhere else to go. Red was a logger by trade, hardened by years of failed promises. He'd lost his job on the coast, then his house in Fayetteville. When he stumbled upon Canaan's old sawmill, half buried and blackened by time, he saw potential, old lumber to sell, land to hunt. To him, ghosts were a luxury the hungry couldn't afford. The locals warned him. "Ain't fit for living," one old woman said at the post office, shaking her head. "That place belongs to her now," Red only chuckled. "Then maybe she'll help me chop wood." He packed his few belongings, a rusted axe and the last of his courage, and drove down the dirt path that led to the ruins. His wife, Grace, didn't share his bravado. She was quiet, small. Her mood always caught between caution and exhaustion. The child, Mary, had been sick most of her short life, thin, feverish, too tired to cry. They needed somewhere to stop, and the remains of the mill offered shelter. The chimney still stood and the beams hadn't all rotted. Red boarded the windows, patched the roof with scavenged tin, and called it home. For a time, it almost felt peaceful. Grace grew a small garden near the edge of the swamp, where the soil was soft and black. Water flowed nearby, murky but clean enough to boil. Red hunted, trapped squirrels, built a crude fence. They ate, they slept, and for the first time in months the world stopped feeling like an enemy. Then the whispers began. At night, when the crickets should have been singing, silence wrapped the woods. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a silence that pressed against the walls, thick and listening. Grace would wake to the sound of soft humming, like a lullaby sung from underwater. Sometimes Mary would stir in her sleep and start to smile, as if hearing the song herself. When Grace asked her what she dreamed, the child whispered, The lady by the river. She tells me she's not lonely anymore. By the fifth night, Grace refused to stay alone after dark. Red claimed the noises were swamp birds or the wind through the trees, but even he began noticing things he couldn't explain. His traps were empty, though untouched. His axe, buried deep in wood, would be found lying beside the fire come morning. Once he spotted a figure at the tree line, woman-shaped but silent, gliding rather than walking. He blinked, and she was gone. The following week, Red went into town to sell wood. When he returned, Grace was waiting on the porch with Mary in her arms, both pale as ash. Behind them, the garden lay ruined, roots torn up, wilted crops strewn across the ground. Grace's voice trembled when she spoke. "Someone came while you were gone," she said. She stood right there by the fence. I thought she was a neighbor till I looked closer. Her dress was black, soaked through, and her eyes... Robert, her eyes looked like she hadn't seen heaven or earth in 100 years. Red gripped his axe, stormed out, marched straight to the fence. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a sign. But Grace didn't sleep that night, and neither did he. Hours slipped by in the dark, broken only by the sound of rain sneaking through the roof. Then around midnight he heard it too. A woman's voice humming the same slow tune their daughter seemed to love. The melody rolled over him like cold mist. Without thinking, he rose, lit a lantern, and stepped outside. The air was heavy, slick with fog. The swamp shined silver in the lantern light. He called out curse after curse, his voice swallowed by the night. Then he saw her. Across the water, half shrouded in mist, stood the figure, a woman in black, veil fluttering though the air was still. For a heartbeat he thought she was real, but when the lantern flickered, she seemed to fade in and out like a reflection on rippling glass. Her voice carried to him, quiet but clear. "You built your fire on my grave," he froze. "What are you?" he shouted. She tilted her head as if the question bored her. "What are you?" she echoed, voice low and hollow. He stepped forward, anger burning through his fear. But the ground beneath him gave way, the edge of the bank crumbling. He barely saved himself from falling in. When he looked back, she was gone, and the lantern flame had died. Red didn't speak of it to Grace, but she already knew. That same night Mary's fever broke. She smiled in her sleep, murmuring the same tune. "The lady says I can rest now," she whispered. By morning her small chest had gone still. Grace screamed until her throat was raw. Red held the child's limp body and sobbed for the first time in years. They buried her near the garden. Grace placed one of Mary's ribbons on the small wooden cross, blue, worn, soft from years of use. 2 nights later, the ribbon vanished. In its place at the foot of the grave lay a single black veil, wet from the dew. Grace was never the same after that. She stopped speaking, sat for hours staring at the swamp. Red tried to keep working, tried to hold on to anything that still made sense. But one morning he woke to find her gone. Only her shawl lay folded neatly on their bed. He searched the woods, shouting her name until his throat bled. At the swamp's edge he found prints, barefoot, small, delicate, leading into the water. Red walked back to the cabin alone. The fire had gone out. He sat down by the doorway, picked up his axe, and waited for the sun to rise. But the sun never came. The fog thickened instead, swallowing the world in grey. Somewhere beyond it, a familiar song began again, slow and mournful. Then another voice joined in, softer, higher, like a child's. When rescuers finally found the cabin weeks later, they said the place was empty, abandoned for days. But one man swore he saw footprints in the mud, 2 sets side by side, trailing from the porch toward the swamp and stopping where the water started to ripple. The others told him he'd imagined it. Yet no one stayed a minute longer to find out. From then on, the land grew wild again. No one dared settle there. The Black Widow had claimed a family, a husband, a child, and for the first time in nearly a century, the singing ceased. But some nights, when the wind bent low through the pines, you could almost swear you could hear 3 voices now, not one, woven together, rising like a hymn for the forgotten dead of Canaan. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Canaan was more myth than memory. The younger generations didn't believe in the widow, not really. They'd heard the stories, sure, but to them it was all just old southern folklore, no different from ghost lights or cursed crossroads. The land had become overgrown again, swallowed by reeds, cypress, and thyme. Only the bones of the sawmill remained, rising crooked from the earth like the spine of a buried beast. Then came the idea to build the Canaan reservoir. It started with the state's need for a new water source. Engineers and surveyors combed the region, seeking a suitable basin. On paper, Canaan was perfect. Lowland, plenty of rainfall, and a nearby river that could be dammed. Government men came with clipboards and cameras, mapping the ruins, measuring the swamp. They weren't from here. To them, the talk of curses sounded childish. "Superstition can't stop progress," one of them said. But progress in Canaan had always come with a cost. The project was headed by George Atkins, a civil engineer from Raleigh, confident and hard-nosed, the kind of man who trusted numbers more than people. He arrived in the summer of 1952 with a small team and began clearing the land. Dynamite and bulldozers tore through the woods where the widows' legends were said to live. The old swamp was drained, its murky water turned into black muck. In the process, workers unearthed bones, animal at first, then human. Dozens of them, some smaller than a child's. Atkins ordered them reburied without ceremony, calling them old plantation graves, but the crew started talking. Whispers traveled faster than orders. Not long after the diggings began, equipment started malfunctioning. Motors refused to start. Fuel went missing. Workers claimed to see figures in the fog, faces pressed against the window of their trailers at night. One man left after he heard humming in the darkness, close, so close that he swore he felt the breath on the back of his neck, though he was completely alone. Another man fell sick without reason, his skin clammy, eyes distant. Before quitting, he muttered a single sentence to George Atkins: "She don't want the water." By September, half the crew had resigned. Atkins replaced them with locals desperate for wages, men who nodded and said nothing. He pushed forward, refusing to let legend stop the machines. One evening, while surveying near what was once the swamp, he found something odd. A line of wooden posts, blackened and nearly rotted, forming a rough circle. At the center lay a mound of earth untouched by years. The locals wouldn't go near it. Atkins ordered a bulldozer to flatten it. "We need clear terrain," he said. That night the rain began again after years of drought. The storm lasted 3 days, merciless and cold. Rain pounded the land, filling trenches, flooding machinery. When the rain finally stopped, the site was ruined. Mud had swallowed the trucks and half the foundation. The reservoir site was unworkable for weeks. Atkins, furious, refused to delay. He stayed behind when everyone else left, working by lantern in a shack near the half-dug pit. The townsfolk later said that was his first mistake. At some point during those nights, something changed in him. He stopped writing in his journals. His handwriting went from crisp order to sprawling incoherence. He began muttering to himself, repeating fragments of lines, phrases no one understood. One worker found a page from his notebook, drenched in mud. On it, written several times, were the words, "She lives beneath the water." 2 weeks later, George Atkins was found about a mile downstream. His truck had rolled into the river. The official report called it an accident, though the engine was off and the keys were missing. Locals claimed the skid marks showed he'd stopped before the edge, as if he had stepped out willingly. But the strangest thing was his face. The body hadn't bloated from the water. His expression looked peaceful, almost relieved. Despite the accident, the project resumed under new supervision. The dam was finished in 1955. When the floodgates closed, the valley filled. The water rose quickly, swallowing the woods, the sawmill, everything. By summer, the Canaan reservoir shimmered like glass, a man-made lake where a century of pain had been buried under 40 feet of stillness. For a while, people thought the curse had ended. Families came to fish and swim along the lake's edge. A few houses were built up on higher ground, and a small town formed nearby. The government declared the project a success. The region flourished for the first time in decades. But success has echoes in Canaan, and some can still hear the old song if they listen carefully. It began again with the children. They'd go down to the lake to skip stones or catch frogs, only to return pale and silent. One girl claimed she saw a woman standing beneath the surface, eyes open, dress flowing, hair drifting like seaweed. A boy disappeared one evening near the shallows. His footprints led into the water, but there were no signs of struggle. When divers were sent, they found nothing but soft mud and a faint humming that seemed to vibrate through the lake bed. Parents banned their children from the reservoir, but the stories spread. Campers swore they saw a black shadow move across the water on moonless nights. Fishermen said their lines would snag deep below, and when they reeled them up, the hooks came back threaded with long strands of black hair. The air changed too, colder near the lake's center, even in summer. Old men who'd been around during the dam construction said it was the widow, angry at being buried under man's progress. A year after the town opened its small marina, tragedy struck again. A young couple drowned after their boat capsized on a clear, calm night. Their bodies were found together, faces turned upward, eyes wide open. Locals claimed the look wasn't fear, it was awe. The coroner wrote it off as accident due to intoxication. But the night after the funeral, the lake rippled though there was no wind, and a sound rose from the water, soft, melodic, unmistakable. Humming older residents stayed inside after sunset. They remembered the name whispered through generations, the one connected to storms, to vengeance, to restless love that burned beyond the grave. They began calling the reservoir by its old name again, Canaan, and it pleased no one to say it aloud. The government still called it Progress. But for those who lived nearby, Canaan was not a place at all. It was a wound that refused to close, sealed in water and silence. Beneath its rippling surface, the Black Widow was not gone. She was patient. After all, death had always been the only home she ever knew. By the late 1970s, the Canaan Reservoir had become an eerie attraction, quietly famous among those who chased strange stories. The nearby town had grown modestly, a diner, a school, a church, a sheriff's office that rarely dealt with more than traffic fines and weekend drunks. Yet everyone knew the reservoir still carried a reputation. Fishermen would joke about the widow's wake when the fog rolled in too thick, but even they packed up before nightfall. Some things in Canaan just didn't feel right after dark. Among those drawn to the mystery was Evelyn Marshall, a young reporter from Charlotte. 26, smart, skeptical, and hungry for a story that might launch her career, she came to Canaan in 1978 after hearing rumors about the lake that sings. The locals were polite but distant. When she asked about the singing, most laughed it off, but when she mentioned the old Whitefield plantation, the laughter ended abruptly. An older woman behind the diner counter, grey-haired, hands rough from years of work, said softly, "That land don't forget, and it sure don't forgive." Evelyn stayed at a small roadside motel near the water. From her window she could see the reservoir spread like a sheet of glass under the moonlight. The first night she thought she heard something, faint, musical, drifting across the surface. She told herself it was frogs, maybe owls, and wrote it down anyway. By daylight she began digging through town records, church logs, and newspaper archives. The name Whitefield appeared again and again, first as landowners, then as ruins. And sprinkled through the decades were small-town tragedies that never quite made sense. Drownings, disappearances, accidents in calm waters. She drove to the county archive, requesting the property maps before the reservoir was built. When she laid them across the table, her stomach turned. The outline of the flooded area matched the old plantation boundary almost exactly. Right at the center of the reservoir, under 40 feet of water, was labeled Whitefield House Grounds. A red X marked the swamp. That night, Evelyn met an old man named Luther Green, one of the last living workers from the dam project. He was in his 80s now, thin as paper, face lined like an old map. When she asked what happened during construction, he hesitated. "We shouldn't have dug there," he said quietly. "There was a mound. Should have left it be. The boss said bulldoze it, and after that the rain came." Never stopped hearing it after, humming low and sweet like a mother putting her baby to sleep. Some of the boys said it came from underground. Some said it came from themselves. He looked her dead in the eye. "You go home, miss. That lake ain't just water. It's grief made deep." But Evelyn didn't go home. The next evening she rented a small boat from the marina, claiming she wanted photos for an article. The water was calm, the air still. The sun sank behind the pines, turning everything gold. As darkness crept in, she set a tape recorder on the seat beside her. Around 9 p.m. the wind dropped to nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of frogs, then even that faded. The silence was so sharp she could hear her own heartbeat. That's when she heard it. Humming soft and low, carrying over the water in waves. She pressed record. The sound grew stronger, more defined. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It was everywhere, filling the air, the water, her bones. A woman's voice, ancient and mournful, yet strangely tender. Evelyn whispered into the recorder, "I hear it. God, it sounds like it's under me." Then something brushed the side of her boat, a sound like a slow drag beneath the surface. She leaned over with her torch, trembling. The light hit the water, revealing movement, something pale shifting just below. A ripple, a glimmer, and then the shape of a hand rising through the water, reaching toward her. Evelyn screamed, fell backward, and the boat rocked violently. She scrambled for the oars, but her hand slipped on the wet metal. The humming swelled, louder now, almost words. She shouted into the recorder, "There's something here, she's here." And then a splash drowned out her voice. The tape ended there. Her boat was found the next morning drifting near the far shore, half full of water. The tape recorder lay on the seat. When police played the tape, they heard her voice clearly, but the background was not silence. Behind her, through the hiss of static, a low female voice sang two notes again and again, each slower than the last, until it stopped entirely. Evelyn Marshall's body was never recovered. The news called it a boating accident. Locals didn't believe that. They knew better. Afterward, fishermen claimed the humming became more frequent, the mist thicker. At dusk, a figure sometimes appeared. At the center of the lake, dark, veiled, unmoving, standing just above the waterline. Always the same spot, always when the sky turned the color of ash. By October, the sheriff closed the marina for safety concerns. But that didn't stop people from coming. Thrill seekers, college kids, ghost hunters. Canaan became a dare, a name whispered over beers. Some came back terrified and silent. Others vanished entirely. The ones who survived told the same story. There was always a voice, always a woman's song, and something below the surface, gliding slowly, watching. Then came the rain again, a storm that flooded the roads and spilled the reservoir into nearby fields. When the water receded, pieces of the past surfaced. Bits of wood, rusted iron from the sawmill, and a single length of ribbon, frayed but impossibly bright blue. It floated near the shore, tangled in reeds. The sheriff collected it and locked it in his desk drawer. But every night after, he swore he heard distant humming echoing from the hallway of the empty station. Years later, that same ribbon vanished. The drawer was still locked. To most, the story of Evelyn Marshall faded just like the ones before her, absorbed into the legend. But for some in town, especially those who remembered the old folks' whispers, her disappearance proved what they had always known. Mariah never rested. Every generation came too close, and every generation paid the price. The land, the water, and the widow had become one. Canaan was her grave and her kingdom. By the dawn of the new century, the town of Canaan barely existed on maps. The reservoir remained still and vast, feeding water quietly into other counties that never knew its story. A few houses clung to the hills, their roofs warped by time and storms, and the old church sat empty except for dust and ivy. Those who stayed had long learned to live with the unease that lingered after dusk. They didn't speak of the singing. They didn't go near the water when the fog rolled low, but the world beyond Canaan had changed. Modernity crawled toward even the most forgotten corners, and in 2002, a group of developers proposed turning the lake into a private resort. They called it Whispering Pines, a name chosen for charm, unaware how close it cut to the truth. Promotional posters showed wooden cabins, piers, and a golf course overlooking what they described as the serene Canaan waters. Locals didn't protest. They'd seen what happened to those who interfered. They just watched and waited. Construction began that summer. Bulldozers flattened the hillsides, trucks ferried timber and concrete, and the engineers came armed with blueprints instead of belief. Among them was a young foreman named Marcus Klein. He was pragmatic, skeptical, a man who considered ghost stories a symptom of small-town boredom. On his first day, he stood by the lake, smirking at the way the mist clung low over the surface. "If this place is haunted," he joked, "she'll have to pay rent like everyone else." The workers laughed, but unease gnawed at the crew as days went by. Radios would flicker with static whenever they faced the water. Nails rusted overnight. Tools left on the docks would be found neatly arranged by morning, as if someone had counted and cleaned them. Marcus blamed pranksters or the humidity. But at night, when the wind shifted and the pines began to sway, the laughter drained from every conversation and left behind a silence thick enough to feel. The first real incident happened in August. A security guard named Don Hughes failed to check in during his night patrol. His flashlight and radio were found near the water, both submerged. The next morning, a faint trail of wet footprints led from the dock to the guard shack, stopping abruptly at the doorway. No prints leaving, no sign of Don. When Marcus reported it, the police searched the shoreline but found nothing. Maybe he ran off, they told him. Probably took the truck. But the truck was still there, keys in the ignition. That weekend, Marcus worked late, reviewing paperwork alone in the site office. The reservoir shimmered through the windows, pale under the moonlight. He rubbed his temples, exhausted. Then came a sound, barely audible, more vibration than voice. A slow, drawn-out hum floated through the glass. He froze. It wasn't the hum of machinery or wind. It was music. A melody, low and sorrowful, winding around him like smoke. He turned off the lights and stepped outside, the night air damp against his skin. The water looked alive, silver ripples moving without a breeze. Near the center he saw something dark, upright, slowly gliding across the surface. He whispered, "Who's there?" And the humming stopped. The silence that followed pressed so hard it made his chest ache. Then the water shifted again, this time closer to shore. He thought he saw a face, a pale oval beneath a veil, eyes like murky glass staring straight through him. He blinked and it was gone. But when he returned to his office, a puddle had formed just inside the door. The footprints leading away from it were small and bare. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He told himself it had to be stress or exhaustion, nothing more. Yet by morning, several workers quit, claiming the sound of humming had followed them home. One man swore he'd woken to find wet handprints on his window, though his apartment was miles from the lake. Marcus urged them to stay quiet. The company couldn't afford rumors. But inside, his certainty had begun to crack. Days later, the project's lead investor arrived, a woman named Rebecca Harker, granddaughter of the man who had once built Canaan's sawmill. She'd grown up hearing her grandfather's tales of a haunted swamp and dismissed them as nonsense. "Let's finish what he started," she told Marcus as they stood overlooking the reservoir. "Canaan's been left to ghosts long enough." That night storms rolled in, fierce and unbroken. The sky collapsed into thunder, the wind howling as if tearing the world in half. Marcus rushed to the docks to secure the equipment. The rain struck so hard it turned the air to smoke. Just as he tied the final rope, lightning lit the lake in a flash of white, and there she was, a woman in black, veil clinging wet against her face, standing at the far end of the dock. Her hands dripped, her eyes hollow yet alive. She whispered through the storm, her voice a breath across the wind. "This was never yours." Marcus stumbled back, feet slipping. The dock groaned as water surged over its boards. He reached for the light, but the darkness consumed it. Somewhere behind him the humming began again, soft, rhythmic, almost tender. For an instant, he thought he heard another voice joining it, higher and younger, like a child's. The dock snapped, the water rose, and the sound swelled into something that wasn't quite music anymore. It was weeping. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The site was wrecked, trailers overturned, docks shattered. Marcus and Rebecca were missing. Only one thing remained untouched, a strip of blue cloth knotted around a wooden beam, still dry despite the rain. It fluttered once in the morning wind, then stilled. The resort was never built. The company abandoned the project, blaming environmental instability. Locals, when asked, offered no explanation. But those who lived nearest to the reservoir said that after the storm, the humming changed. It was sharper, fuller now, 2 voices, sometimes 3, rising together before fading back beneath the surface. Years later, travelers driving along the old backroads near Canaan still report strange lights hovering over the water, shadows moving beneath the ripples, and faint melodies slipping across the air in the early hours before dawn. The old maps may call it a reservoir, the new signs a no-swim zone, but the people who know the story call it something different. Not a lake, not a ruin, a reminder. The Black Widow of Canaan still keeps watch, bound by the land and the grief that made her, and every few years, when the mist rolls thick and the moon burns red above the trees, someone new will hear her song and vanish into her silence, leaving only ripples behind. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.